So like Caitlin said, I'm a library officer in the local history team at the City of Port Adelaide Enfield. I'm based at the Port Adelaide Library, and our team receives many queries around family history due to the port being a primary place of arrival for European migrants to South Australia since the 1830s. In a previous talk, I showed how to find information from various different sources in both Australia and overseas. And today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at 3 other online resources that will add additional information to what you would find in Ancestry. If you have any questions as I go along, feel free to put questions in the chat box, as Caitlin has already said. So I'm just going to quickly recap how we can access Ancestry. So just bear with me whilst I share the screen. Okay, so first things first, having a library card for any South Australian library is a must, and this can be easily arranged through your local branch library. Once you have a card and you know your PIN number on your card as well, Ancestry can be accessed at any branch library via the computers there. And during the pandemic, we've been really fortunate in that customers with internet access could also log on at home. So this is an example of a catalogue page that you would find for a South Australian library. They all look a little bit different because each council has a different appearance with their thing, but if you've got any questions, your local library should be able to show you how to do it. So under the digital library section, we can click here, for example, on family history. And basically, there's a link to click through. I've already logged in today, so just to make sure that everything worked. But basically, you click on here and you'd log in using your barcode and PIN number. Okay, so this is the sections to search for things, but I'd strongly encourage when you're searching to click on begin searching. Basically, the reason I would suggest that is a lot of the resources on Ancestry are targeted at American customers because a lot of the customers are in America, and this way you can then be more Australia specific. So if we just click on begin searching here. So this is the basic search screen. As well. You can also include the place where your ancestor might have lived and the birth year too. Next to the search button, there is another thing called show more options. And this might be useful if, for example, you know a parent's name or, for example, the name of a sibling or a marriage date, and you're looking for something specific like that. So basically what we're going to do today is we're going to look for one particular person called Thomas Bevan Rake. And we're going to see what we can pull together about this one person just using online resources. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tick on match all terms exactly. The reason I'm going to do that is I'll show you what happens when we search differently using the exact search and when we don't, and see what different things appear. So I'm going to type his name in now. Second. And I'm going to just put Australia in here. The reason is it's not necessarily going to be a common name with that particular middle name. And if, for example, there's a resource somewhere in New South Wales or Victoria, if you moved around for some reason, we might find something in another state that we're not expecting. Okay, just click on search. One second. Just bear with me. Having a technical issue, just bear with me 1 second.
Okay. Is everyone hearing and seeing this okay? I just want to make sure that our connection is good and that people can hear and see what work is presenting. If you're having any technical problems, just type in the chat box and I'll see what I can do. I just wanted to make sure that, because mine sounds a little slow, but I could just be my connection. I just want to make sure everybody else can hear.
Yeah.
Are you hearing everything, Warwick?
Yeah, I am. So I can hear everything you're saying. Just bear with me just 1 second. I'm just going to relog back in because I think there might have been an issue with my login. So just bear with me 1 sec. So sometimes we have technical problems with these things. It doesn't matter how many times you do them. So just 1 sec. Let's have a look. We'll start again. So just going to relog back into Ancestry. It might have timed out because I've been offline for a little while. So let's just try again. There we go. I made a mistake. Basically, I spelled his name wrong. I got the middle name wrong. And that's an example of where if you use the exact search, if you don't get it exactly right, it will find nothing. So that's a good example about how not to do things. Okay, so basically, here we are. We have 6 different matching sources for this person, including a World War I record here, a World War II record, a death, a grave that's listed as well that matches the deaths in 1961 in this case, and we have 2 electoral rolls from 1943 and 1941. What we're going to do first, we can also see there's also a family tree that's been built by somebody. So what we're going to do is we're just going to jump into the World War I record. Now, the good thing with the World War I records that are available on Ancestry for Australian veterans is that they've been digitized. They're all digitally available, and we can actually look at the original that's been scanned. Okay, so here we are. So this is an example of a World War I military record. It can be zoomed in and out, so there are zoom options to be able to do that on the page. We can also toggle between different sections. So basically we can toggle from page to page with the arrows at the side. The zooms are here. You can also download the record. So for example, you can download it, you can print it, so you can save a copy to look at later, even if you're, so for example, to a USB stick or email a copy to yourself. So it's really good and intuitive. So even if you don't necessarily have access to Ancestry at a later date, you can grab that information. So from this first page, we can zoom right in. Okay, so this is as far as it will let us zoom. You can see that Thomas here, it's saying he was born in Enfield. Sometime based on the age, so 19 and 11 months. So that's a 19-11 out of 12 years. So if we go back from when he enlisted, that means he's born probably roughly around June 1896. He's a horse driver. We can also see that his next of kin is a woman called Alice Batten Brake, and that's the name of his mother. So we've got information to start with that lets us know about that. So as we scroll further down, it asks if he was ever in the military anywhere. Basically, it's saying he was in the cadets for 4 years and in the citizen forces as well and still serving. So there's lots of information there. But the great thing with military records is there's often several pages and it can go from many pages. So we're going to scroll through and have a look at some different information that you'll find. And this is where a military record can be really useful because birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates will contain some information, but they won't tell you that he has a scar on the right side of his stomach. They won't tell you that his weight was 144 pounds or that he had a fresh complexion and blue eyes. Now, there might not be photographic evidence of some of these people, and it may be an ancestor or a relative that you never encountered. So this are the kind of information that you wouldn't necessarily find anywhere else. And to be frank, there's probably not information on this now about most of us, unless it's in a medical thing. So basically, it's really useful. So military records are a really good source of information if you do have someone who served in the military sometime. So you don't really know what you're ever going to find in these particular records. I've seen some examples where there's been German paperwork in the World War I record, and that's where there's been someone has been taken as a prisoner of war, and then they've got records. The German paperwork in relation to the capture and the maintenance of the person in a prisoner of war camp is actually inserted into the file. So there can be some really fascinating elements to these things. So I'm just going to scroll through and see what we find. Sometimes the first page is kind of duplicated with different information. And keep going. There we go. So that's just confirming again some of the information about him. It can be duplicated because back when the paperwork was originally done, sometimes people would be enlisted and go to different places, so therefore it was added together. You can also see the offences that people carried out. So in this case, he was being in a state of being unorderly on parade, and he was kind of charged for that. You can see when people travelled in and about on boats and things like that, and also where they served. So if someone had an illness when they were overseas, that's often recorded in here too. So just scroll to the page. So this is an example of a piece of correspondence that you'll find here. In this case, it says that this is from 1919, and it's written to Mrs. A.B. Rake of Enfield in South Australia. And it's saying, information has been received from the AIF headquarters, London, to the effect that your son, Corporal Artificer T.B. Rake, 4th Divisional Signal Company, proceeded to America per the SS Celtic from Liverpool on the 25th of August for the purpose of instruction in agriculture and pig rearing methods. So upon receipt of advice that he is re-embarked for Australia, you will be promptly notified. So this is really unusual. So in this case, he's a World War I veteran. He's finished his service. This is a piece of correspondence from November 1919. So this is actually after the Paris Peace Conferences at the end of World War I. He has then been sent to study in America, and that has been added to his military record. It's highly unusual for that to be the case. So that's from 1919. Now, we have another piece of correspondence later on, 30th of September 1920, and its cabled advice has been received from California to the effect that your son, Corporal T.B. Rake, Divisional Signalling Company, is returning to Australia per the SS Sonoma, which left San Francisco on the 21st of September 1920. Any further inquiries should be made to the Staff Officer, Returned Soldiers, Military Headquarters, Keswick. So this is a really useful piece of information because there's not necessarily going to be anything anywhere else that will say that he's gone to America. And that's quite fascinating and very unusual. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to scroll back out of this page. So just bear with me 1 second. So if we look here through the other elements that are added onto this page, we can, I'm just looking, we can see that on this, it's just got these elements of the World War I, World War II, death, grave, and electoral roll records. If I edit the search to not be an exact search, so if I basically make an amendment so that it's got initials and sounds like as well, and we change the search, we might find more than 6 sources. The thing with this is you can't be 100% certain that it's going to be the same person. There might be some resources you find that are different. If I click into there, we find a lot more sources straight away. So we've still got the ones that we found originally, the electoral rolls, but there's an interesting one that's the next one down. And that is here, we have a New South Wales, Australia unassisted immigrant passenger list of a Thomas B. Rake travelling from San Francisco, California to Sydney, arriving on the 12th. So I'm just going to open it up. This, I'm just going to see if I can find his name. They're often alphabetical. Yep, there we go. We have Thomas B. Rake. He's basically, this is the shipping record of the ship that he came back to Australia on from the United States. It shows that he sailed from California It matches the information from the military record. We didn't find that in the original search. The reason is his initial on this is B. So because we did an exact search originally and we didn't toggle to a different setting, it didn't find him because we put Bevan as the middle name. By having the initial search as well, it adds that additional factor. Okay, so this is where when you're using Ancestry, it's really important to play with different searches. You might find additional information from different places through that. Okay, does that make sense? Good. Is there any questions so far? I'm just checking. Is there anything? If anyone's got anything? No? That's okay. Good.
I'm not seeing any right now.
No, that's all good. Cool. Right. So I'm just going to look at the other sources on Ancestry before we move to another page and another website. So there are also electoral roles here. So I'm just going to open this up. So for South Australia, there are electoral rolls from the periods in like the late 1930s to 1940s that are digitally available through Ancestry. If you're looking for other electoral roll information, the electoral rolls are held physically here at the State Library. Hopefully at some point they'll digitize more of South Australia's electoral rolls through Ancestry, but at this stage there's not as many as there are for some of the other states. So if we look here, this gives you an example of the information that you'll find through an electoral roll on Ancestry. We've got Thomas Bevan Rake of McLaren Flat, a Vigneron. And the only other person in this particular district that's listed is Lorna Mallion Rake of McLaren Flat, Home Duties. Now, based on that, it's likely to be the same person because he's working in agriculture. This is 20 years later, so it's wholly possible he's taken some transferable skills from one area to another. And it's not necessarily the biggest shift because he's moved from working and his family seemed to live on a farm based on the original military record. So maybe he's just moved to working in a different area. But we're going to remember that name, Lorna Mallion Rake. The reason is she could be a wife, a sister, a daughter, or it might just be a coincidence of someone who's got the same surname and is in the same district. But they're both living in McLaren Flat. And they're together, so it could be someone who's related, but we can rule out the fact it won't be his mother because her name was Alice based on the original record. So it's something to consider. There was another adult living in that area. And the other thing that we've got on here that's of interest is the World War II military record. Now, World War II military records have not been fully digitized yet. However, there are some on the National Archives site that are not on Ancestry so far. The National Archives are currently in the process of digitizing that information in the same way as they digitized the World War I ones. And so due to that, what we're going to do is we're going to go and have a look on the National Archives and see if they've done that yet for this individual. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the next page. So this is the National Archives website. You can find this through a Google search or just use naa.gov.au as the website. And basically through this site, we can find lots of digitized records and also some lists of records that are not necessarily been digitized so far. So what we're going to do is I'm going to click to explore the collection. So if you just bear with me 1 second. So in here, there's an element called record search. Okay. Now what we want to do is click into name search. In this case, I'm going to put in Rake and then Thomas Bevan or Bevan. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it. Okay, so when we look for the category of records, we can see all sorts of different options. So basically, these are federal government records. So the sorts of things you'll find on the National Archives site are military records or immigration records and passenger lists. So things that the federal government would have had some involvement with. I found some of my colleagues' parents and things through this website, including nice photographs of them through some of the immigration elements for people that have come from countries outside of the UK to Australia, where they came through the migration process and naturalised. So there can be some really interesting different elements that you'll find on here that you wouldn't find in Ancestry. What we're going to do is I'm just going to click to search, in this case, the World War II. I might just search, yeah, and just see what comes up. Okay, now this has got Thomas Bevan Rake, date of birth 4th of June 1896, which is a rough match for the period that we found on the World War I enlistment record. It says his place of enlistment was Adelaide, his place of birth was Adelaide. We have to be a bit fluid when it says place of birth. If you're born in Port Adelaide or McLaren Vale or Enfield, it may very well be that they would consider that Adelaide as a place of birth when you're enlisting. It means the wider area. So you have to be a bit careful when you think about where someone's exactly born, because the same place could have a different definition based on how wide you're looking. But the most interesting thing with this is that there's this little symbol here, which it has view digital copy. In this case, it means there is a digitized version of this record, and that's really good news. So we're just going to open that up. Okay, so just bear with me. Toggle the page around a little bit. Okay, so this is Thomas Bevan Rake's World War II record, which hasn't been added to Ancestry so far. Is that?
Not seeing that one.
You're not seeing that one? Okay, just bear with me just 1 second. Just 1 sec. I'm just going to toggle to see if I can bring this up. Just bear with me. 1 sec. Sorry, I'm just trying to access the right page. 1 sec. No. Okay. What I'm just going to do is I'm going to find a screen. I have got it up on my screen, but it's a bit difficult to share it because it's not in the same browser. So just bear with me 1 sec. I'll show you a screenshot of what we're looking at. Just 1 sec.
Meanwhile, if anybody has any questions so far, please type them in the chat box and we will get to them as soon as we can.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to share something that I took a screenshot of earlier. I can see it on my screen, but because it's in a different window, it's a bit complicated. Basically, the World War II records are available and searchable through. This is this is a screenshot of one of the pages of his military record. Can you see that? Is that there, Tim? Yeah, you've got it. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so basically, in this particular instance, it says that he's a secretary as a job. He's a secretary of the Phylloxera Board, which when I looked into that, the Phylloxera Board, strangely enough, still exists today. That's Vine Health. And those are the people that deal with the fruit fly. So strangely enough, with the fruit fly epidemic that has been in South Australia recently, he actually was the secretary responsible for that in the period around the 1940s. He's also, it lists that his previous military service, it gives us a date of marriage, which is something we can then potentially use for information to find elsewhere. It also lists that basically it's got his next of kin. This is where on the military record on Ancestry, it said his next of kin was Norma. Here it says Lorna, but it's really strangely spelled. So I think that they've actually probably made a mistake. But if you remember the name we found on the electoral roll, it had Lorna Mallion Rake there. And so she's listed as his wife. So it was kind of a reasonable guess that it was going to be the case that it was his wife. The other interesting thing on this first page, though, is it asks about his qualifications, and it's got yes, technical. And then it's got other diplomas, and it says University of California in Agriculture. So this, again, corroborates the information from the World War I record, but it gives us even more information. It shows us he was based in California when he was engaged in his studies. So that's another bit of padding that you can add to the same person. Now, another part that you might see on a military record is, for example, through the medical examination. So on the previous one, it kind of, for example, said he had a scar on his right stomach. It didn't say anything particularly interesting apart from that. But what it says here is that he wasn't fully fit to necessarily serve as a World War II soldier, but he's listed as having a high amputation of the right arm. Well, there's no mention of that in the World War I record, which raises a big question as to, well, how do you end up with an amputation in the intervening period between 1919 and this is probably around 1940? So that's going to be something we're going to come back to see if we can find out more. So, yeah, so basically it just continues on with additional information. It's got Norma, Mally and Rake listed here as the next of kin on this particular page. This is where you have to be careful when you're looking at research. If you think about the average piece of paperwork that someone fills out now, they're cross-referencing information from all over the place. His next of kin, one person heard it as Lorna, another person has heard it as Norma. And so in one bit of the paperwork, it says Lorna, in another bit, it says Norma. So someone obviously misheard him and just scribbled down what they heard. So the names, having exact search names can be a bit of an issue because sometimes people hear things wrong. Sometimes people spell things wrong. And these days with the standardization of our paperwork, it happens less. But back in the day, in sort of the 1940s, these errors were quite common. We also have more information here on his medical history. So when we look at this, for example, it has information and details of the fact that he was a secretary in a vigneron. He's listed as a C of E, so he's Church of England as his religious denomination here, which is slightly different to before where he was a Methodist. He's still got blue eyes, that hasn't changed, brown colour of hair, dark skin. He has a scar from his appendix. So for example, on the previous one, it said he had a right scar next to the side of his stomach. This explains that he must have had an appendix removal at some stage. And again, we can see the different things that he's not got and he has got and the different things. But the other thing that's really interesting on this page is it says arm off, 22nd of something, 36. So we've now got a rough date for when something happened in relation to his arm. And it was in the intervening period between World War I and World War II. So what we're going to try and do is work out what exactly happened to his arm. Okay, now this is where conventional government resources won't be helpful. So the conventional resources that we have in the terms of, for example, a birth certificate, a marriage certificate, they're not going to give us that information because you don't have a government piece of paperwork that occurs when you undertake some kind of surgery like that. So what we're going to do, just 1 second. Just bear with me. I'm going to open up another site now, and just 1 second. So this is a website called Trove. So Trove is probably my favorite website when it comes to doing family history research in Australia. This is a project that was undertaken by the National Library in coordination with the state libraries and territory libraries around Australia, where basically they have digitised millions of pages of newspapers. In total, there's 6 billion different records added into Trove, including different physical resources where you can search for what different libraries around Australia hold. But the element that's most interesting in terms of family history are the 23 million different digitised pages of newspapers that exist. These are all freely accessible, and it's from over 1,000 different Australian newspapers from across the country and a few overseas ones as well. The majority of these are from before 1955, and later newspapers are patchy due to copyright and restrictions from publishers and things like that. So that's something to bear in mind. So, but if you're looking for something that happened before 1955, It's an absolutely brilliant resource for anything significant. So if you're looking for a birth notice, death notice, a marriage notice, if someone was divorced, there isn't necessarily something in Ancestry that will tell you that a marriage ended. However, it's wholly possible the information is in here. The quantity of things you find in here do depend on how prominent an individual was. So much as today, if you're famous or you're infamous, you might make the newspapers. If you're the average person, maybe not so much, because there's not necessarily going to be so many things that report about you. And another thing to consider when it comes to Trove is if you live in a country area as opposed to a metro area, there will be more information about you. The reason for this is country newspapers often contain greater detail. So they'll report that Mrs. Smith went on holiday to visit her sister in Port Lincoln, if it's from Port Pirie, because of the fact that they had less to report in the papers. They were padding information out and there were fewer people to report about, and everybody knew each other. So they reported things like that. So that's something to bear in mind. So basically, to find Trove, the website is trove.nla.gov.au. But if you search Trove newspapers in Google, you'll find a link straight away. Okay. So as with Ancestry, what you type and how you filter it can have a significant impact on the number of resources and results that you find. So with the name Thomas Bevan Rake, he might appear in an article as Mr. T.B. Rake, or T. Rake, or Thomas Rake, or Mr. Rake. So what you search for will find different things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play with the advanced search and go to newspapers and gazettes. So what I can do in this particular case is if I search for Thomas Bevan Rake as a phrase, and I search specifically in South Australia, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click search and see what happens. So we have 9 articles, and so we have several different ones. And if we look here, we have recovering after loss of arm, popular McLaren Vale orchardist. So this is an article from 1936, which if you remember from the previous military record, it specified that he had an injury in 1936 that led to an amputation. And if I click into here, we have a newspaper article, and it specifies that he was recovering after the loss of an arm. Excellent progress is being made at the Adelaide Hospital by Thomas Bevan Rake, about 40, single, orchardist of McLaren Ale, so that's probably a typo on the original print, whose right arm was torn off just below the shoulder at North Walkerville on Monday afternoon. Riding a motorcycle, he had put his arm out as a signal when turning in the opposite direction to a motor lorry. Bleeding was remarkably minimised by an elastic recoil at the inner layer of a brachial artery. Now, this is an example of where newspapers, you have to be a little bit sensitive to the information you're getting. It can be quite graphic. If there's something graphic in there, the newspaper is often reported with far greater detail than they do today. So there can be some, if you need to just be careful if you're a person that has like sensitive views on how you respond to things. So I'm just bearing that in mind. But this newspaper article gives us additional information again. So Mr. Rake is a returned soldier, and he has been heartened by the news that his orchard at McLaren Vale is being kept in order by 3 close friends in the district, 2 of whom are also returned soldiers. Secretary of the Southern Branch of the Grape Vendors Association, a member of the committee of the McLaren Vale sub-branch of the Returned Soldiers League, and a member of the Legacy Club. Mr. Rake is very popular throughout the district. His extensive work in the interests of the growers is much appreciated. Although he served as a dispatch rider in France with the 4th Divisional Headquarters Signals, Mr. Rake was not severely wounded. So this explains to us as to what's happened to his arm, and it gives us additional information. So that's something else you wouldn't find in Ancestry, because it's a really specific tool that you're looking at. Trove will find things that you wouldn't find elsewhere. So there are all sorts of different stories that there might be in your family that might have been reported in the newspaper. It's definitely somewhere that I would look at accessing. So another thing to consider when it comes to searching for things is that the information that it's searching, it's basically a computer trying to read an article. So if, for example, the print is slightly off or smudged, then it might not have the accurate information. It might not read it correctly. So volunteers sit and correct the information on Trove to improve the accuracy of the search. So you don't always find things exactly how you would want to. It could be that, for example, if it had misread the word rake, this article's been corrected, but it might not read that. So searching for different keywords in Trove is really useful. So it might be that you might want to search for just the middle name and orchardist or things like that using keywords of where people had lived. You might find different results. Another thing is different societal attitudes from the time. So newspaper articles for women would sometimes say things like the wife of John Reginald Smith instead of Sarah Smith. So in that case, if you were looking for a death notice of a woman, sometimes it will only reference the husband's name, which is not something that would happen now, but historically was something that might take place. So if you're looking for things like that, it's worth considering searching for another relative, and that's something to bear in mind. Okay. You'll often find that a marriage notice will begin with the surname at the beginning of an article. So for example, where if you were looking for Thomas Bevan Rake, it wouldn't necessarily have the full name as a phrase. What it might have is Rake and something, and then the friends of Thomas Bevan are invited to. So searching for different things in the advanced search will give you so for example, you could put Thomas Bevan here and then rake as a separate word, and it will look for those two things in the same article, but not necessarily together. So it's worth playing with that to come up with different things. So what I'm going to do now is an example of this is to search for Lorna Mallion. The reason for that is that we know that they were married. I don't know what her maiden name is. So if I search for Lorna Mallion, that's an unusual combination. Again, we're going to look at South Australia because it seems that he spent time here, and see if we can find a marriage notice. Okay, so we've got two newspaper articles from 1938. And if I click in, it's going to give me a page here. And I'm just going to scroll and see if I can find the right one. What I might just do is do Control F, which then lets me look for something. Yeah, there we go. So if I click onto that, we can then see a marriage notice for Rake Gill on the 5th of April at St Andrew's Church, Walkerville, by Archdeacon R.P. Hugill, Lorna Mallion, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. P.C. Gill, Church Terrace, Walkerville, to Thomas Bevan, son of Mr. and Mrs. T. Gill, Rakes Road, Walkerville. So this is where we can use different information, search in different ways. You can see here, Thomas Bevan is written separately to Rake. So searching for Thomas Bevan Rake as a phrase wouldn't find this. So you need to play with different searches when you're looking for things. But this adds a lot of additional information to where we were. You could really start to broaden out a family tree from this. From the military records, we established his birth in 1896. His next of kin was his mother, Alice. From this, we can assume that his father's first initial was T. He went to America in 1919 after the war and studied agriculture. He returned to SA and became a vigneron and lost his right arm in a bicycle accident. And he married Lorna Mallion Gill. We established that he lived in McLaren Flat during the 1930s and 40s, that the electoral roll confirmed that information as well. And from that point, there are many different paths the research could take. We could search for T. Rake of Rakes Road, Walkerville. We could search for Alice Batten Rake, his mother. We could look into Lorna's family now that we know her surname's Gill. There's all sorts of different ways you could take the research. I'll give you one other example, though, from the newspapers before we move to the next page. And that is from one of the other searches I made. Here, for example, there's an article that doesn't mention his first name at all. Mr. Bevan's Rake's modest shack at McLaren Flat. So there's even an image in one of the newspapers of actually the place that he lived. it is quite a modest looking shack when you look at it now. But yeah, so that's an example of a newspaper from 1933 where we find different information. Okay, so are there any questions in the, I think there's some things coming up in the chat. Yeah.
Warwick,
Yeah.
so Yvette would like to know why information in Trove is only available before 1955.
Yep, that's a really good question. So some of it is in relation to copyright. So for the periods after that, I believe that the publishers have the right to not allow you to digitize and put that information out there. I know that there's issues with News Corp, and they being one of the largest publishers in Australia, they've been unwilling to provide access to their back catalogues to be on. There are some papers that are available for later periods, but they're not, unfortunately, they're not ones that are particularly useful for Adelaide. So the Victor Harbor Times, I think, is one of them. Another one is the Canberra Times, where they're up to quite recent. So they've included through several decades that we don't have, unfortunately, newspaper coverage for. There are one or two examples of some sort of niche local papers that existed around Adelaide that kind of cover a different period. But it is frustrating. Yeah, in an ideal world, we would absolutely have access to more information. And hopefully one day that information will be extended. I think that there's also an emphasis on digitizing and making accessible some of the older resources, because you see naturally things degrade over time as well. So there's a real preference to digitize the microfilms and some of the physical copy papers, so that because they would degrade. But yeah, hopefully at some stage it will include later resources, because yeah, it would be really handy for researching. Yeah.
One more question from Robin. What family tree software or system do you suggest to keep a record of everything found?
I don't have a particular suggestion. There's various different ones around it, and to be honest, I've not really used any of them myself. I originally built a family tree through Ancestry through a subscription and used that. I've also built one through Family Search, which is the Latter-day Saints technology that they have. So I don't really have a recommendation on what software to use for that. There are quite a few different products around. I know that some people, they prefer to search to make sure that they've got access to download that data to use and then be able to transfer it to another site should the software become obsolete. So that's using, so like there's different file types for Word documents and PDF documents. There's also a file type for family history things. I think it's GEDCOM. And yeah, so basically I don't really have a suggestion on that. It's personal preference, and yeah, I'd just ask around of different people that have done it themselves as to which one to do for that, because I don't, sorry, I can't give you advice on that, I'm afraid. Yeah, is there another question?
No, I think that's all for now.
Good, excellent. Okay, so I'm just going to toggle to some further pages. So another place you can search for people is cemeteries. Now, we have a rough idea from Ancestry as to when Thomas passed away. Fortunately for Adelaide, a lot of the major cemeteries have searchable websites. So Centennial Park has a website, and 4 of the other major cemeteries are on the same site, separate to Centennial Park, and that's the West Terrace, Cheltenham, Enfield, and Smithfield are all run by the Adelaide Cemeteries Authority. So those 4 have a searchable website, the Adelaide Cemeteries Authority, and Centennial Park has a separate one. So this is a place where you can potentially search graves and see who else is residing in the same grave. So where those 4 are concerned, you might find a husband and you can't find out where a wife passed away or when she passed away. You may possibly find that she's in the same plot, and in that case you can then go further with your research that way. So in this case, I'm just going to click on memorial search, and we're just going to search for Rake as a surname because it's not that common a surname, and we're going to see how many hits we get. So we don't get very many, but what we do get is Thomas Bevan Rake here on the 4th of November 1961, but we also get Lorna Mallion Rake in 1989. So it might be that we can't find the death listed because the death might be outside of the period that we can actually look for due to state restrictions. But whilst you might not be able to find the legal death, you may possibly find a burial. And this is where searching cemetery websites can be really handy. If you're looking at country areas in South Australia, a lot of the councils have information on their website. So for example, I know Port Augusta has several different cemeteries that you can search through on their website, and you can search there. And they have kind of a combined database where if you're looking at some of the country cemeteries, that can be really useful. So yeah, so that's just another additional element. It won't necessarily give you lots more information, but it might give you a sense of finality. In this case, Lorna Malyon-Rake died in 28 years after her husband, but you can see she didn't marry again probably because she's got the same surname. So that gives you that confirmation of information as well. So let's have a look. That's one thing. So we're just going to go to the State Library website now. Say, for example, you don't know where to look. Well, that often quite happens with quite a lot of things. You might have a particular thing that you're interested in researching, but you're not 100% certain where to even start looking. What I would strongly suggest is to go to the State Library website and to the Family History Guides. The reason I say this is a really good place that compiles information on different topics and gives you an indication as to where to look. So it might not necessarily have lots on the website to look at itself, but it points you in the right direction of different places to search. So here, for example, we can see different subjects. I'm just going to click into the Aboriginal Family History section for a start. So for people interested in researching Aboriginal family history, it's not the case with Thomas Rake. However, this is an example of where it points you as to different topics and resources. So it specifies that the births, deaths and marriages were recorded in South Australia from 1842. It's the case that some Aboriginal people would not have been registered due to the locations of the events and also due to some of the policies at the time. But what it does is it gives you different places and tells you what the State Library has, what resources they hold on this particular topic. It also shows you can click through the different tabs for other organisations and it tells you what they have. So for example, the State Records maintains a searchable database of Aboriginal people identified, and that contains information that you can search through. I know that the State Library also points people in the direction of the South Australian Museum as well, because they have records and information of sort of family histories that have been compiled of different families too. There are also things about children in institutional care. So for example, things relating to the stolen generation, and so there's different records that can be useful in this area. They may not all be digitally available. That is one thing I would say. That's the same with everything. But this is what gives you different points of contact to look at. Okay. And another place I would refer people on to, particularly with this, is the State Records site. They have a senior Aboriginal access officer that you can contact to provide you with assistance when you're looking at access records. And yeah, so as I say, this is a particular, it's a different area of family history that often relies on different resources. They're not always digitally available. But yeah, there are specific people that can assist you with that. Okay, so if we just hop back for a second to the family history guides, there's all sorts of different topics. Now, the one I'm just going to quickly go to are the almanacs and directories. So we're going to find one more resource that we can look online to find Thomas Rake. So basically, the almanacs and directories were used by postal delivery services and as a way to work out who to deliver to and where. They were basically, they're really useful for family historians because they were the only way to track movements of individuals and families, because electoral rolls are incomplete. They don't include every adult necessarily, they'll include the primary one. and you can see movements of different people around. Directory generally listed only their head of household as well, but it gives you an address and it sometimes gives you an occupation. And many of the earlier directories can focus more on businesses. So if you're looking for an individual, you're often better, you have more success later on. So what we're going to do, because we know around in the 1940s, Thomas lived in McLaren Vale, we're going to see if we can find him there. So I'm going to just quickly click on the 1943 directory. Hopefully this loads. You're seeing that okay? So this is the directory for South Australia. We can search for rake. Just 1 second. And here we can see various different examples of where it's looked for the word rake. It's found Rakes Road here, Rakes Road. Another one here that's a rake, but we got it. Well, I'm just going to click on this one on page 520. It even makes a nice noise that sounds like you're turning a page. So I'm just going to zoom in on this page. 1 sec. Just bear with me. Top list at the top. Okay. So we can zoom in on a page and we can scroll around. But here, oops. Sorry, I'm just going to have to move things around the page a bit. Okay, we have a bee rake listed as an orchardist in McLaren Flat. So the country ones are not generally as useful when it comes to the directories because it doesn't give you like a street address. If you're looking in a metro area, it will often list the residents on a street and it will list which street they're between. So for example, say you're looking at Semaphore Road, it will tell you the Federal Hotel and then who's resident there and who's resident in the next property and who's resident at the Semaphore Hotel, and you can work your way down the street physically. It's not like that for country areas. They basically alphabetically listed people in towns. So it doesn't give you an exact location as to where he lived in McLaren Flats. But what it does is, again, it confirms to us that he was living there. But the clue that's interesting with this is it's got B as his initials, and that shows that he might have gone by his middle name sometimes. So this is another example of where you have to kind of search using different terms because you don't know what people went by. Sometimes people went by and just dropped their first name and went by their middle name. He's the only rake that's listed in McLaren Flat. He's an orchardist. That matches the vigneron information that we had before. So yeah, basically that's an example of some of the different sites you can go through. I hope that all sort of made sense to people and I've not got too carried away. Basically, I've tried to give you snapshots of various different websites and what you can do digitally online. You won't necessarily find as much information about every individual. The reason being, not all of us are in newspapers, not all of us are World War veterans, but there's all sorts of different sources you can use beyond Ancestry that will give you far more information and pad around the information you'd find there. So I hope that makes sense for people.
Thank you so much. Robin has a question, and the question is, trying to find history of convict movements in Tasmania has proved difficult on Ancestry. Is there a Tasmania database of convicts which has better records?
Yeah, so what I would suggest where that's concerned, I'm just going to open up a page, just bear with me, is the Tasmanian libraries. They have, oops, 1 sec. They have family history information. Just 1 second. Explore the collections, family history. So if you search for Tasmanian libraries, all the Tasmanian libraries are collective. The state and the council ones, they're all under the same umbrella because it's a smaller state. They have all sorts of, they have a Tasmanian names index, Aboriginal ancestry, convict life. They have various different guides in the same way as our state library one does. They also have a searchable database for their information. So you can often find things like kind of marriage certificates, death certificates in a way that we can't do that in South Australia as easily. And there's a lot more detail, including scanned shots of them. So actually searching for someone in Tasmania, whilst there won't be much on Ancestry necessarily, and I'll say the reason why this is, basically Ancestry operates as a business model. It will focus on where the larger quantity of demand is. Because Tasmania is a state of 500,000 people, they're more likely to have scanned and digitized information for New South Wales, where there's 8 million people. So because more people will want to access the New South Wales records, they tend to prioritise that first. So for example, you'll find more electoral rolls for Victoria and New South Wales than you will for South Australia. The reason is there's just more demand, and therefore they prioritise that. Whereas, because it's a smaller state, Tasmania has actually made a lot more of their stuff available and accessible online. So I would suggest you go and look there, and even contact the library if you've got a specific question. They've often got like a query